We have Madalyn Mendoza. Madalyn Mendoza's career in local news spans a decade. Her expertise and ability to pivot from reporting on critical national issues on social justice to features on amplifying local cuisine and culture have made her a champion for the city and a multi-faced authority in regional news. As a homegrown Latina journalist, equity is what drives Madalyn's reporting, covering all sides of the city and elevating the voices of so many who are historically disenfranchised. Please welcome to the stage, Madalyn Mendoza.
Good evening, everyone. My heart is racing just hearing all these stories and just to understand that I'm part of this amazing group of presenters. It feels very unreal. As Peyton mentioned, I am from San Antonio. I am from the south side of San Antonio, to be exact. Woo! So, about a year ago, this time last year, I was deep in the trenches of my fellowship with Columbia Journalism School, researching redlining, something that I didn't know had impacted so much of my family for so many years. And so there were so many nights that I spent crying over the documents that I found that are all easily accessible in the UTSA archives. And you'll see some of those in my presentation. You'll see a lot of screenshots, a lot of photos that I took during my interviews. And yes, it's my story, but it's so much just the story of San Antonio and the story of these amazing people that I met along the way. So let's get started. Redlining was a New Deal policy which gave racial segregation federal teeth. We feel the scars of disinvestment daily. It's why we ask, what school did you go to? It's why the West Side only recently got a bookstore. It's the reason people from historically disenfranchised parts of town drive 15 minutes for something other than Whataburger, and that's no shade to Whataburger, but food deserts are also part of the problem. Throughout my research and conversations with people who were part of the Edgewood walkouts in the 1960s, I realized so much of the history has been lost from generation to generation. I was about 22 when I finally learned about it, and that's shocking because I grew up and still live in a community that was redlined. The city's racial equity report shows a glaring example of stunted opportunity. Only 16% of Latinos 25 and older earned a bachelor's degree. It's the second worst, only higher than the other demographic. Meanwhile, 43% of the white population earned degrees. San Antonio's Mexican culture has a pull, but its people were pushed back. And even before federal agents came to town and sectioned off the city into places that were worthy of loans and parts that would be too much of a risk because of their minority populations, there were racial covenants in place. San Antonio had deeds explicitly restricting anyone who either A, had tuberculosis, B, were Mexican, or C, were Black from living near white people. The disinvestment proved deadly on the night of September 9th, 1921, when more than 7 inches of rain fell on the sleeping city. The wall of water ripped through hotels and businesses downtown, accruing millions in damages, but the loss of 80 irreplaceable lives was concentrated along the Alasan Creek, otherwise known as the West Side. Homes were swept off their foundations like paper boxes, and babies were snatched from their mother's arms by the torrent. Hernandez, Ramirez, Rodriguez were some of the surnames of victims listed in the papers. Ages ranged from 2 weeks to 60 years old. Death didn't discriminate based on age, but the impacted West Side streets, Tampico, San Marcos, South Laredo, revealed a clear inequity. After the flood, San Antonio shored up the city with the almost dam construction in 1927, which is something city leaders knew they should have done years before, but the dam still didn't help the West Side. In fact, Olmos Park, the neighborhood developed around the dam, had the racial covenants that I mentioned earlier in place. And less than 15 years later, the abandonment got federal teeth when the New Deal-era Homeowners Loan Corporation reinforced the racist landscape. Throughout the 1930s, federal agents were dispatched to U.S. cities to build out maps for investment, labeling areas best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous for lenders. Corresponding Outlook reports include painfully racist language. It said Mexican residents had an adverse effect on the city. That's their quote, not mine. The document reads, there are many economic drawbacks in San Antonio's large Mexican population. As a class, they are non-productive, socially inferior, and in times of stress, a burden upon the community. The assigned agent exclusively met with wealthy residents in his dispatch. John Bennett Sr., a prominent banker, was interviewed. He said, San Antonio's dependency on a non-productive class like Mexicans and retirees had something to do with the failure of real estate to appreciate in values. Without investment, colonial-style homes became standard in redlined areas. This is actually the street I grew up on. Utilities didn't extend to these neighborhoods, so mules were used for water deliveries. Roads were unpaved and lacked flood prevention. Westsiders called the area Barrio de Charcos, or neighborhood of puddles, because of the flooding which made walkability impossible, causing days of lost wages and learning. In the 1950s, San Antonio's school districts began consolidating. Areas that were able to raise more money off property taxes had a better chance of being invited to group up. Edgewood, which had a substandard housing stock, was left to fend for itself, becoming one of the poorest districts in the nation. Students were taught in classrooms that were so cold they could see their breath. The young girls were told they didn't need to apply for scholarships because they'd be teen moms. Some teachers told students they didn't need to learn from textbooks because all they cared about was having stomachs full of tamales. On May 16, 1968, the Edgewood students made history when they walked out against the disparities after years of being dismissed and kept from a higher quality of life post-graduation. Some of the issues the students were fighting against included a lack of certified teachers, a need for college-ready curriculum, and crumbling facilities. The issues came to a head in July 1968 when Demetrio Rodriguez, Martin Cantu, Reynaldo Castano, and Alberto Sneed filed suit on behalf of their children, who they said were receiving a low-quality education. The state filing was the start of a landmark SCOTUS decision that would spark education equity conversations nationwide. And in that photo, you can see a desk is holding up the chair because they didn't have AC. That's Demetrio Rodriguez and his children. Both legal inertia and policy making have taken place over the years, but still so many social indicators have been wrapped up in what advocates call tentacles of redlining. The pandemic revealed many of these ugly truths, like the digital divide. Experts say there's a heavy correlation between historically redlined areas and the communities where connectivity lags or is non-existent. Let's narrow in now on what redlining looks like today. The Economic Innovation Group found the 78207 zip code is 98.5% distressed, and nearly half of its residents do not have a high school diploma. On the other hand, Alamo Heights maintains its history of comfortability, where only 6% of residents are not high school graduates. The purpose of this map and the 1930s redlining map are different. One's the cause and the other's the effect, but they look almost identical. Descendants of the San Antonians who were swept away in the flood and then redlined remain sidelined nearly 90 years later. Patty Rodriguez, Demetrio Rodriguez's daughter, is a lifelong champion of the West Side. She's frustrated with the lack of progress and questions whether it'll take another 50 years for San Antonio to see real change. She says lawmakers go around in circles and provide Band-Aid remedies. As San Antonio quickly grows and fights to define our identity, it's vital to remember our history, to understand why things are the way they are, to fight for each other, no matter the zip code or color of our skin. Because we are not the San Antonio of the 1930s or the 1950s. We are the seeds they tried to bury. Thank you.
I have questions. You're a reporter, you ought to know. Wow.
That's so much to say.
That's okay, I'm glad you did. So and I'm glad you brought that up because these are uncomfortable topics so far until we get to the next speaker who knows what they're speaking about, maybe like balloons or something. But, it's a possibility. Anyway, who helped spark this fire in you? Obviously there was a seed there, or a little ember that was burning, and somebody just came and poured some gasoline on it. Who was it?
Well, I had always heard that the city was divided up based on the highway system, and I don't really know. I know it's more like Culebra separates the redlined areas on the south side, but by what was and what wasn't. And then when I saw this fellowship opportunity arise, I thought this would be a perfect chance for me to do this because I hadn't seen it really. I mean, it's been reported on, but even when I was going through my archives and research, it had been years since anybody had said anything, so it was no wonder that I hadn't heard anything myself. When I started working at the Express News when I was 22, it was news to me that my family or my neighborhood had all these obstacles in place, and that it's a proud moment to know that I was a first-generation college student, but it shouldn't have been that way. It's kind of an indicator of how far back we were pushed. So yeah, I guess it's just like a life experience that.
Yeah, No, I totally can understand that. And so that recognition of it and that study of it obviously empowered you and gave you that creative vibe that you already had. That you already had that creative vibe, and then you can speak about it, right? Why do you think that people don't like to talk about these issues, other than the fact that they're hard?
I think it's
talk about.
Yeah, I think with any hard issue, it's embarrassing to realize that these things happened, but it's room. You know, I love San Antonio, I'm the biggest champion of San Antonio, but we have to realize our history if we want to move forward and make sure that these things don't happen again, because one of the professors that I spoke to said, you know, it's one thing to say, oh, these people were so bad and we will never do it again, but then you see things happening today that are kind of, you know, run parallel. So we can't grow if we don't know our history.
Right. We have to change the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a fun one, okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll step away from that.
I promise I'm not this serious all the time.
So you've been on the news, and you've been reporting for a long time. Share with us your most embarrassing news blooper.
News blooper.
Because we all go onto YouTube and watch those. I mean, you know, what about the guy who was going to blow up the Home Depot bathroom? I mean, you know, we've all...
Well, my first job out of college was a high school sports reporter. And that's funny because to this day, I don't know anything about football. And that's what I was reporting on. I don't know how I did it, but I'm sure I messed up at some point many times.
So hopefully some of y'all are Googling that right now.
No, I don't think
and it'll go viral a little bit later.
Thankfully, it's not documented, I don't think, at least.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing that. Madalyn Mendoza, ladies and gentlemen.